Good afternoon, everyone. Good. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well? This round table for an excessive and anti-ableist sexuality. We shall have with us a fabulous panel with notably some of the heroes of the day, Daniel Gonzalez, the filmmaker for accessibility. Daniel Gonçalves.
Good afternoon. I hope you have enjoyed the movie.
And we've seen this film, and I feel the room has witnessed its pleasure at watching the film. You are also a member of the jury for FIFDH this year, and you're also a filmmaker. You've made the film. You were a filmmaker for a film that was also presented at the International Film Festival and Forum for Human Rights. Your film was nominated in various festivals, including a festival in Poland. Welcome to Geneva, and thank you for being with us.
About me, I thought that sounds like me, but it is. Thank you. Very confusing with the headset.
On parle de vous. Et puis on a Hélène.
Yes, we were speaking of you. And then we have Elena Pont. Elena Pont is an assistant professor at the University of Geneva in the section Educational Science at the University of Geneva, and you're interested in the educational path of both professionals and persons in situation of disability. The interpreters apologize. Unfortunately, the sound has gone away. We can no longer hear the speaker.
Ça fonctionne?
Is it working? Hardly. We apologize. We cannot hear the speakers.
On ne m'entend plus non plus.
Et celui-ci?
We apologize. The technical team will soon fix it. Unfortunately, none of the microphones seem to be working right now. Oh, Daniel Gonçalves' microphone seems to be working.
Oh, hello.
No, none of them are.
It's not working.
Ouais, pas de souci.
Hello.
On m'entend, Daniel. On m'entend.
Okay, you can now hear me. Great, we are back.
On retourne sans Elena.
Allô?
Elena can also be heard. Great, all of us are now audible. Except for Ella is the one person we cannot hear. Now we can hear. Yes, we can. Thanks. So we can now hear everyone. So I said you are an assistant professor at the University of Geneva in the section Educational Sciences, and you are particularly interested in the educational path of people living with disabilities. Welcome. Thank you, Malik, and good afternoon to everyone. And we also have live from Paris in Dr. Elisa Horace, who is a lawyer and an anti-ableist militant, who is also the author of Mr. T and I and the Marabout. I apologize, I cannot hear anything. I don't know whether you are able to hear me, but I cannot hear anything that is going on in the room, says Eliza.
Est-ce que vous nous entendez, Elisa?
Eliza, can you now hear us? Elisa?
C'est décidément un débat sur les situations du handicap. C'est formidable.
So this is a debate about disability and difficult situations. Elisa, can you now hear us? Live from Paris, we have Elisa with us.
Je ne pensais pas Paris.
I didn't think Paris was that far away from us. You can still not hear us. I apologize, I cannot hear a thing. If you don't mind, I will now start the debate. Yes, I can now hear you. You're with us. Thank you. Formidable. Good afternoon. The issue is I also hear myself, hence the echo when we hear Elisa back, and the interpreters apologize in advance, as it's very hard to hear her. So you are an anti-ableist activist. You've published a book called Mr. T and I in the Marabout editor. It is the story of, it's a very humorous stories. It is a love story, but a novel that is extremely political. I welcome each of you to this debate, which is presented with the Centre Maurice Chalumeau and the in Sciences and Sexualities of the University of Geneva, with the support of the Foundation Pro Victimis. Daniel Gonçalves, I have to open this debate with you. You have produced this first film, which was autobiographical, and then this second film with the sexuality as a central subject. What was at the origin of this film? Why did you pick this subject and not another?
Bom, a ideia do
The idea came when I was putting together my long film. So, in my first movie, I talk about my sexual experiences, and then for the second movie, I worked with Vinicius. We had already some experience with the first movie, and then we decided to make a second movie talking about sexuality. But back in 2017, when we first had this idea, we did not envisage much how the movie would come about. We thought about the movie, it would be a taboo to talk about disability and sexuality. So at first I did not see the taboo, but once we started making the movie, we started seeing the taboo about these two topics. And actually, the shootage went through 3 stages. First, in 2018, so we had a few interviews. And with the first interviews, we could shoot about 2-3 minutes, and then we send a sample to a laboratory. And through a lab, we found a sponsor, the Global TV company. They were interested in our movie. And at the end of 2019, the global broadcaster decided to sponsor our movie. But right after that, we had the pandemic, and we had to put everything to a halt. And then at the end of 2021, we resumed the project. And we then decided to take part in a bidding process. We won, and with the money we got from this bidding process, we resumed the shooting in 2022. And the period in which we could not work because of the pandemic was somewhat good, because we identified, with the benefit of hindsight, that we needed to have more interviews. And we also need to identify more persons with disability that could contribute to the issue of sexuality. So by May 2022, we started the second stage of this shootage, and then from July until January 2023, we edited the movie. Then we started screening it in different film festivals. And an interesting piece of information to share with you. It was very difficult for us to have our first award debut. Actually, we presented our movie to different festival directors, but they were afraid of screening it and that the audience would refuse it due to the different taboos within the movie: sexuality, disability. Of course, we could talk about sexuality and disability, but when we talk about these two topics together, it could be somewhat difficult. But little by little, we could break this taboo. And actually, that's the 16th festival in which we screen our movie. And we are very pleased to be here now in a festival which deals with human rights, because sexuality is one of our fundamental rights. And that's why it's important not only to talk about it, to see it, but also to have a discussion about it as well.
Thank you. We'll discuss the definition of sexuality earlier. Well, it has been discussed earlier. Is it a right or is it a freedom? I know that not everyone agrees on the definition of sexuality. Thank God, actually. I'll turn to you, Elisa Rojas, particularly with your book. Mr. T and I published it with the Marabout, the editor Marabout. It is a love story with a very political background, since it reclaims the right to love a person who doesn't have a disability as a person with a disability. But this book doesn't directly deal with sexuality, but it deals with everything that precedes sexuality, everything that may lead to a sexual relations, feelings, complicity, and as well as other elements. Please tell us of your book in a way that's perhaps more precise than mine.
I'll explain a couple of points. First, I don't believe that my book talks about a right to sexuality as a person with disability, but it's more about freedom for people with disability to feel attracted to somebody who's with disability or not. And I also talk about desire, which is a matter that I find particularly interesting. I'm not going to sum up my book because it's also rather a difficult enterprise, but I found it important to talk about desire, and in particular the desire of women with disability, also because it's easier for me to talk about this because it's my own desire. It's easier than to talk about other people's desire. But there's also another aspect that bears importance, which I touched upon in the book. It's the fact that when we talk about the sexual life of people with disability, many able-bodied people talk about this, think about this in an inappropriate way sometimes, and in a very intrusive way as well. And there's an expectancy for people, for able-bodied people, for us to reply, to give them answers to their questions. And my goal was to talk about this topic without giving able-bodied people the answers to the questions that they feel free to ask us. So, of course, it's important to be able to speak freely, but what I wanted to say was that I didn't want to give details which seemed useless or inappropriate, but I wanted to talk about desire. This book is also about love because it seemed paramount to me. I wanted to talk about how relationships can be hindered between able-bodied and people with disabilities, because we all live in this domination system which gives power to able-bodied people, and this gives them power over representation, love, sex, and particularly people with disabilities representation in the media. And I think this encounter and the possibility of creating a relationship on an equal footing is exactly what I wanted to show through a simple story, because when I was a student, a law student, I fell head over heels in love with somebody in my class, and this person was not a person with disabilities, and this rose so many different questions in my mind, and this is what allowed me to go on this path and to try and understand all of the intricacies in this love story, this very banal, normal love story, and this proved to me that it was important to explore this and to speak up about all of these issues which concern people with disabilities, because we need to own our own representations, our own narratives, and we need to speak freely in order to make our cause progress. Thank you.
Petit aparté, c'est marrant.
I'd like to delve into words and meanings together with Elena Pont. Elena Pont, you're a sociologist. Big question. What is an inclusive and anti-ableist sexuality? I don't know who wants to answer first.
Écoutez, je vais peut-être prendre la...
Well, I can take the floor and give you a reply. An inclusive sexuality would be, according to me, something along the lines of what Elisa said. It is a sexuality that is linked to self-determination. We were talking about rights and freedom, the right to express one's own subjectivity, feelings and emotions towards able-bodied people, black, white people, etc. Any person, really. And this is where inclusivity is related to the realm of rights, the right to express our own identity without any barriers and without the barrier of disability. I like this expression. Ella, do you agree with this definition?
Yes, I do. I think a minute ago, earlier on, when we were chatting out there and you said that you were going to ask the definition of sexuality, I was thinking, I don't really know how to answer that other than like it's being horny and wanting to fuck. So yeah, I don't have a very intellectual answer, but that's my answer.
Excellent. Well, at least it's direct and understandable. Thank you. Do you agree with this definition, Daniel, after directing this film?
I think so. I think that's the more direct and the simplest definition, actually. I think people can be themselves independently of a particular definition. It's about desire and feel desired.
Ela falou.
In a nutshell, that's what Ella said. I couldn't agree more.
Je vais vous poser une question.
I have another question for you. It's maybe a bit intrusive. Obviously, please do not answer if you don't wish to, but do you believe that today in your own lives, whatever your lifestyle, do you believe that you have access, you can access this freedom and this inclusive sexuality, this anti-ableist sexuality?
Je ne sais pas qui d'entre vous souhaite.
Who would like to reply? Daniel, maybe? Or Ella? Ella, go ahead.
Yeah, that's another tricky question. Let me try and give a more eloquent answer, an elegant answer indeed. Well, yes and no. I think, so obviously I'm visibly disabled, but I also am, like, I guess fairly attractive, like normal face, all that shit. So, like, I've got the conventionally attractive face, but kind of freakish body, in inverted commas. So people are attracted to me, but then you touch on it a bit in the film, there's often like a bit of a, people are shocked that they're attracted to me. I get that quite a lot. But I mean, it's not, I don't see this as tragic because, and I talk about this in my own film and my own work, is that being disabled is a really good way to weed out the bigots and the arseholes. But basically, sadly, thank you. But sadly, the answer is no, because I think that the world is built on ableism. I think that there's a baseline ableism with just everyone. It's really sad, even us disabled people. So it takes a lot to kind of break through the barriers and stuff. But then I say it takes a lot, but also, you know, you get used to people quickly and whatever. So I think the answer is yes and no.
Daniela?
Daniel, Elena, Elisa, do you wish to reply?
I think yes. But it wasn't always the case. As I said in the film, at the beginning of the film, there was somebody asked if a certain girl was staying with me as a girlfriend because they felt sorry for me. So I think there are three possibilities. There was the person that isn't going to want to be with me at all because they are prejudiced. For example, I once went on a blind date with a person that didn't know that I was disabled. I didn't always say I was disabled, and sometimes it's difficult to identify that I am disabled. So I went and used an app, and I went on this blind date. We said, look, well, let's meet in such and such a place. And then I got to that place. And then the person stopped answering. And then she came up with excuses, such as, like, my brother's feeling ill. But that wasn't the case. It was just an excuse. So that's one possibility. Then we have another possibility. You have a possibility that someone is going to meet you because they know that you have a disability, but they don't feel completely comfortable. That has also happened to me. And then there is also the possibility that a person doesn't know anyone who's disabled, so they meet up with you, and then they have no problem at all. So I would say that probably the person who I'm with now, Danny, who I've been with for 8 years, falls into the last category. But You know that sometimes when you go to a place where people don't know you, the first option for them is to think that we are either related, that she is helping me, that we're friends. And often people are very surprised to discover that we're a couple and that we live together, that we're going to get married, and so on and so forth. So a lot of people still find that quite shocking. And I think I would say, yes, I have found somebody who has no problem with my disability, and that is the person I am in a relationship with.
Well, I hope you find that. So I'd like to now address Elena and Elisa. What has been implemented today? What are the existing tools that allow to enjoy the freedom of sexuality? Well, personally, I do not see much being implemented to that effect. Maybe Elisa can answer better than I can. I will answer the previous question because it's harder for me not being in the room to demonstrate my interest for a question. Well, the reality is that I'm not sure what we mean by including an anti-ableist sexuality. The inclusive word is a great is something that I'm not comfortable with because it is a word that is very much used by in politics and in public policies, and it's a word that is now meaningless. And what interests me and what I feel ought to be the priority is to make sure that relations between people, whomever they are, and notably people with disability, may be implemented on the basis of reciprocity and equality. And equality is what complicates relations, that sometimes makes them impossible, is that very often people with disabilities are considered as being inferior. They are constantly disqualified partners, whether they're men or women, and even more so when they are women, because they are at the intersection of two systems of oppression, which are ableism and patriarchy. And therefore, the question for people with disability, particularly if they want to enter in relations with able people, is how to create a relation that is not asymmetrical, how to create something when one is not being dominated by their partner, whomever they are, because supposedly one would be considered to have less value than them. And that is the issue. I believe that it is on these matters that one must work on and that we should ask ourselves questions about. Elena, would you like to complete this answer? Well, I think a solution in order to be able to speak with legitimacy of inclusive sexuality would be to facilitate access. The concept of access. How can one access spaces of socializations when there are steps? How, when one is in a wheelchair, you're speaking of just access in general. Yes, that's the question of access, I think, is an important one for us to be able to meet and for us to attempt this normalization of relations which are sometimes asymmetrical due to institutionalizations and marginalization and all sorts of projections that exist on people with false representation, as Elisa has said and as the film has clearly shown. With this subtext of the person who was speaking of non-biological ancestors. I think this will start to bring the question of disability in all matters of access. How can spaces be more accessible, whether they're physical spaces, discussion spaces, any social space that requires social discussion, to make sure that disability is an issue that can be solved through relational or technical solutions in order to foster contact, and relations can then grow, deepen between people, as the film has shown, in order for people to get to know each other better. But even if we know each other better, and despite having interpreters and French Sign Language or other sign language, having ramps, despite all of these efforts, isn't there an aspect we're forgetting, which is education to sexuality? I will speak of education full point. This is my domain. Yes, there is co-education. There is an education access to knowledge about disability and the experiences that come from living with a disability, which goes beyond technical facilitations. And knowing that all of us here living in the same world have a specific relations to the world. And it is this relation that must be deepened. And for people living with a disability, this relation and this interaction is often one that is filled with obstacles, despite them having a subjectivity which is filled with what would be a normal world and what they would need to do to themselves be normal. And we hear it in the film. There is a constant relations to people with disability to what they imagine to be, again, normal sexuality, a normal relation to the world, a relation with normal people, whatever the definition of normal is, which is obviously has to do with normativity. So the idea of having a normal relationship with the world, a normal relationship with people beyond seduction. And there is also the internal relation with oneself, which is the relations that one has with differences and the way in which it is discussed in public spaces and in the media. And this relations to the norm is what could create a space for discussion and a space of common ground between able people and disabled people beyond the issues of disabled women and cross-sectionality, as Elisa was saying. Why wouldn't we speak of what is this relations to normality and what people with disability have created as an ideology and what links them to people with normality? There is this idea of what unites us and what we have in common in relations to the world. Perhaps we should look more into what we have in common rather than the differences, to see what unites us rather than what differentiates us before we speak of our differences and before we highlight our differences. Perhaps it is this perspective that we must educate and reverse. I could propose another way to reverse our perception. Danielle's film was entirely dedicated. If that film had been entirely dedicated to able people, would we be discussing it? No, that would be the norm. That would be just normal, so-called normal sexuality, normative sexuality, probably with cisgender people, with heterosexual, within heterosexual relations, what we know as being extremely mundane and normal, and we wouldn't be discussing it. But that is a world that doesn't exist. A world in which the sexuality of disabled people is interrogated, but it is this own diseducation, this own perspective that ought to be considered, to make the choice, the self-educational choice of inverting norms in order to create discussions around what unites us and what differentiates, but mostly what unites people. I have a question for Elisa Horace. I know you hate the upcoming subject, but we will speak of sexual assistance. It is the #1 subject in the media. Media speak of sexuality and access to sexuality via sexual assistance. Is sexual assistance nowadays a problem? Is it a solution? What is it? I would like to. I was thinking about this when I was preparing the debate. I said there are people who are there to take care of people living with disability. Doesn't this take this responsibility away from people, from able people? I'm putting this in brackets, but doesn't this take away the duty to socialize that able people may have? Who would like to react to this? Elisa, is it something you'd like to react to? It is not that I hate the subject, it's just that I consider that it is the only subject that is looked into by the media when we speak of disabilities. It's almost obsessional, and I think we must be weary of everything that are seen as specific solutions. I don't believe that specific solutions have led us very far. Everything that marginalizes, everything that enforces the idea that we ought to have a specific sexuality, where I don't think we have a specific sexuality. And I think this carries risks, and I think it is dangerous because the norms that you were speaking of earlier, these are the ones that exclude us from the public arena, those that exclude us from relations, including sexual and affective relations, have been defined not by divine intervention. It is able people who have marginalized us, who have excluded us. It is not something that was done by chance. It is something that was done by design. When one we reach a point of creating specific spaces to unite, whether children or adult disabled people, there is a will to exclude and to marginalize. And what needs to be given back to disabled people in any sector is their choice of life, their autonomy, the self-autonomy. And it's in the question of the dependence of disabled people, constructed, organized by society. And this is the issue against which we must fight. If we can regain our financial autonomy, if we have the technical and human means to regain an autonomy, then the logic would be that everything would be simpler, including sexual and affective life, since this is the subject we're discussing today. Just a geopolitical point today. In your country, in France today, the subject as his sexual assistance, it remains unclear from a legal point of view, and it doesn't allow us to reach a true legislation and a practice, whereas in the United Kingdom, the Herd of Social Workers has ratified that social workers who would help a disabled person access sex, including sex work, could not be condemned. And whereas in Switzerland, there isn't a clear ruling about sexual assistance, and this changes from one canton to another to the joys of federalism. I would like to speak of an essential subject, I mean, everything appears to be essential today, is sexual violence, as well as structural violence, social violence, human violences. Perhaps by starting with you, Ella, if I am thinking back to your film, which I saw a year ago, you must have seen it many more times than I did, but in your film, you speak of your maternity with your son, River. You have, and I think you say so in the film, where people try to convince you not to have a child? Is that due to your disability?
No, people didn't try and convince me not to have a child. But definitely I've experienced a lot of I don't know, shock that I'm a mother. But no, I'm sorry, no, I didn't talk about that. I wonder what you're thinking about. Let me try and think. I don't know. Do you have an alternative question?
Je pense à votre rapport, peut-être on voit.
I'm thinking of in the film, there is this woman who, in the film that we just saw, there is a woman who goes to a gynecologist for the first time at 40, and she's being infantilized, and there is this issue of the intimacy and the question of sexual health, and maternity is part of sexual health, which is not adapted with people with disability.
That's true. And I did have some, particularly while I was pregnant, I had some bizarre and uncomfortable experiences in the maternity ward. I was very ill while I was pregnant. I had a blood clot, and I experienced some, horrible discrimination when I was in hospital. Some from individuals, although there were other, lovely medical staff also. But I think what I'm thinking about now is an experience from a friend of mine. I'm sure she wouldn't mind me sharing, an autistic friend who, she was a teen mum, and her birth and her labour and her birth were just wrought with doctors and midwives just not listening to her and not believing her. Just because she's quite overtly autistic, and I think that's just such a common experience within the disabled community, is just not being listened to, and it's so frustrating. And I think that this film is just so good, but it's so humanizing, and I really, really think it's sad that we're having to make work that just humanizes disabled people. It's such a basic thing, but it's the most important thing for now where we're at, I think. So yes, I applaud you.
Thank
you. La Suisse a été auditée.
Switzerland. There was an audit about our country by the UN on the way Switzerland was implementing the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and it shows that over 80% of people living with disabilities might be victims of sexual abuse in our country. And according to the Minister of Solidarities in France, apparently 30% of people with disabilities under 18 have already suffered from sexual abuse. And this is 10% of people, able-bodied children. And Switzerland allowed chemical castration on people with disabilities historically, and this is a very worrisome fact. So what do you believe is the solution to this? What could we do right now in order to make this stop, to make these numbers decrease? What do you believe would be working?
Bon. Bom,
Je vous entends.
bom, eu acho que
I think, unfortunately, I cannot think of any immediate solution.
uma das coisas que pode ser feita
That said, one of the things that must be done is what we are doing here, is exactly what we are doing here. Because we know that many persons with disabilities suffer from violence, but that's not very much debated, especially in Brazil. In Brazil, this is non-existent. And one of the objectives of our movie is to give visibility. We start showing examples of women that suffered from sexual violence because they were persons with disability. We had a witness of, you saw in the movie, an example of a woman who was blind and her boyfriend would remove the condom without her noticing. And that's one of the objectives of our movie, to show it to different institutions, police stations, the prosecutor's office, in order to raise awareness about those issues, and also to help these women to receive more attention. Also, and that goes also for persons who do not have disability. We need to work to reduce violence against women, may they be women with disability or not. We needed to put an end to sexism, patriarchism that is very rooted in our society.
acho que o principal é falar. E aí,
And I think the most important thing to do is to talk about it. And when we talk, when we show what we have seen today, we can gradually contribute to bring down those absurd numbers of sexual violence against women. But like I said, unfortunately, I cannot see any immediate solution. I think it will take time, and we still need to close a few gaps so that we can achieve this objective.
Il nous reste 15 minutes déjà. La discussion passe vite, il y a tellement de...
Thank you. Time is flying by. We could talk about this for hours. I suggest that we give the floor to the public, which I'm sure has many questions to ask you. Well, I hope so, at least, because otherwise it's too much work for us. So we're going to light up the room, and we have several microphones that can be distributed in the room, so do raise your hands.
Il y a déjà plusieurs questions, j'attends vos temps de micro.
I see that somebody's asking for the floor at the third row. Can you give them a microphone?
Bonjour.
Thank you. Hello. Hi. My name is Nadia Morand. I'm a sexologist. I am also a person with a disability. And I've got two things to say, one question and one comment. First, the comment about what you said about inclusive sexuality. I tend to think that it's a bit like organic food. You don't need to write organic food on the organic food. You need to write shit on the shit food. So there is an exclusive sexuality, and inclusive sexuality is just normal sexuality. My question is for Daniel. First, thank you so much for your film. I was very moved by these different stages where the non-biological ancestors are being mentioned and summoned. And there's a huge work on history done by associations and organizations, and it's very important. So thank you so much for highlighting this.
Qu'est-ce qui vous a permis, vous, de
What allowed you
sur cette question-là et de
to work on this topic and to put it forward in your work?
Oui. Bom, foi durante a montagem.
It happened when we were editing the movie.
Os nossos personagens trabalham muito com esse tema da ancestralidade.
Many of the characters that you saw in the movie work with ancestrality. And when we were doing the interviews, when we were editing the movie, we thought it would be important to highlight this topic. It's not something that I thought from the onset. It actually happened when we were putting the movie together, but that came from the different characters of the movie. If you recall, Amanda, that lady who shaved her head, she was one of the characters who decided to bring this idea forward, amongst other characters, such as João, who is the last character, closes the loop when we end the movie. So once again, this idea came about when we were editing the movie to talk about ancestrality.
Peut-être une autre question. J'ai vu d'autres mains.
Another question. I have seen other hands being raised. So someone at the front.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Stéphane Rastello de...
Stéphane Astello from the association Retour d'Image, based in Paris, which works on representations of disabilities in cinema. I wanted, rather than questions, I wanted to bring a couple of comments about the question of sterilization of people with disability. There is a film, a documentary that was filmed a few years ago by the founder of Retour d'Image, Diane Maroget, who is herself a situation living with disability, and she produced a film which is called Forbidden Maternity, Maternité Interdite, where a heterosexual couple
La femme avait été
living with cerebral palsy, and the woman had been sterilized due to family pressure for her not to have children with another person living with disability. In terms of violence, gender-based women, and particularly against women with disability, there is the association Femmes pour le dire, Femmes pour agir, women to speak, women to act, and who act for women with disabilities who may be victims of sexual violence. And also, I wanted to say that I wasn't surprised that Daniel Gonçalves' film had a hard time finding its way to viewers, as this is yet another proof of ableism, that the fact that producers, distributors, etc., are able, and therefore they ask for a representation of disabilities that would be compatible with able bodies, and this shows films that are completely disastrous, such as the one Tout le monde debout in France from Franck Dubosc, who felt he was looking into people with disability because a mother is now in a wheelchair, and this shows how deep this person's thought process was. Wink, wink, being ironical. It is mostly a film that was co-written by a person with disability, which completely conforms themselves to the stereotypes that one expects of them. Someone with a cerebral palsy, with a mental paralysis, who lives with their mother, living with a who has access to a sex worker because they're a public person. We know that their sex life and their reality is very different from that. So the problem is that if disabled person play the game of ableism, then we are all in big trouble and far from a positive outcome. So I find it remarkable that this space was created here in order to seriously speak of ableism and the sexuality of people with disabilities, as this was an issue that was only one of able people. And if we look at the lives of able people, then if we look around ourselves, I realize that there are able people who do not know what a sex life is to this day, and and I'm a disabled man, and yet I have a full and fulfilled sex life despite being disabled. Elena Pont on this matter, while preparing today's roundtable, I have mentioned Charlotte Puiseux, who is an anti-validist activist living with disability, who was present last year here at the International Film Festival and Forum for Human Rights. And she said that she was never as disabled as she was within a feminist collective. Today, are we able to create true intersections for a woman who is victim of sexual violence so that she may be able to speak of her experience without being stigmatized by her own disability? Well, it's difficult. It's very difficult. Women with disabilities have specific experience which are at the crossroad of two discriminations, sexism or heterosexism, and that of disabilities. And it seems that in most social situations, it is the disability that takes over in regard, rather than the sexism that disabled women are victims of. So it is hard for one's voice to be heard, because for centuries, disability have been associated with idiocy and one's being unable to make a decision, or a status of oppressed or discriminated against, whereas disabled women experience the situations of heterosexism just as any other, as other one, and it is a continuum of representations, extremely extremized representations, that where people are they're considered as children, or the hypersexualized women, or the person with a deviant sexuality. And this is difficult to be heard as an abused woman when one is, when we, and whereas abuse very often of cisgender heterosexual women who are also living with a disability, this situation, this status of victims is shared with that of abled women, cisgender heterosexual women who are being abused or beaten, killed.
Très souvent.
And this is what we ought to be made aware of. The social destiny, as Simone de Beauvoir has said, of women, the social destiny that we experience as women, of of which the abuse is part of. And in that case,
Écouter la voix de femmes
to listen to the voice of women.
handi.
So we need to hear women and women of disabled women. So one more question. One more. I think I find very interesting what has been said about representations, because when valid people decide to speak of disability, then everyone finds it extremely positive. It is a lot easier to reproduce. And there is no problem for these productions to exist. And they always go in the same direction, in the direction of biased representations. But when it is disabled people themselves who want to take control over their own representations, it is the case in documentaries, Danielle's documentary or my film, then it becomes a lot harder to find spaces for these productions to exist, because they go against the narrative that able people have of our own existences. And therefore, we must absolutely give priority to productions by disabled people themselves. We must create spaces, possibilities. We must give them the means, the space, so that disabled people may themselves produce everything they desire on their own experiences and existences, as well as their representation.
Merci. On arrive au terme de ce débat. À 25. Pardon.
Je voulais juste réagir sur deux.
I wanted to react over two things and to give a testimony. So the first thing that I wanted to speak of is, why do we speak of deviant sexualities? There is great openness about sexuality. I wouldn't use the word deviant. It is a choice by one person to say, I am this way or that way. We shouldn't use the word deviant, because when we use that word, we already impose a stigma. But I am in favor of speaking of this, that if we really want to speak, then we should speak of sexuality, full stop. We don't have to describe other people's sexuality. It is for individuals to describe their own sexualities. I don't believe that other people should impose anything. It's the same way where disabled people, if they want to call on escort services or sexual assistance, then they have the choice to do it or not. It must be a right of each individual. But we are simply experiencing a sex life for those who are lucky enough to have a sex life, and those who do not have the opportunity to have a sex life, then they ought to be given the possibility to have access to a sex life, perhaps by calling on sexual assistants or escorts. But let's take an example. It is as if it was an improved psychotherapy, because I've called on these services for a while, and I feel it completes my psychotherapy. There is the aspect psychotherapy when we go see a psychologist with whom we will discuss issues discuss sentimental issues, cerebral issues, or family issues. This is traditional psychotherapy. But the psychotherapy I need on top of that is that of the body, and that means that we will add the matter of physical sensations by speaking of many other issues that may create a true link with the person with whom one is, by telling them, I've experienced this, what do you think of that? What is your idea? How could you help me do this or that? And to say how we can together make an idea a reality. And this is something that truly works for us, but we must be opened to many things. And once again, I'd like to say that sexuality is universal. We shouldn't add deviations. Everyone is entitled to pleasure, whether they're disabled or not. And once again, I would like to thank escorts and sex workers because they are happiness traders, because for people who are unable to have relations such as valid people, this is something that truly helps us in our lives because it brings happiness that we would otherwise not have access to. So thank you to all of these people. That is what I would have wanted to say.
On arrive donc au terme de ce débat.
So, following this debate for a inclusive and anti-ableist sexuality, I don't believe we found a definite answer, but the debate shall continue. And we must continue to ask ourselves this question. Elisa Horas, let me remind you that you are a lawyer and an anti-validist, anti-ableist activist. Daniel Gonsalves, you are the director of the film. Ella Glendening, you are a filmmaker and director. You are a member of the jury at the FIFDH this week. Welcome to Switzerland. Have a great stay. Elena Pont, you are an assistant professor in the section of educational sciences at the University of Geneva, and you are particularly interested in the educational path of people living with disability. And I will come back to you, Daniel Gonsalves, Director of Accessibility. The Swiss wants to know, the FIFDH wants to know whether your friend was able to access their condom. Yes, he managed.
But it took about 10 minutes, but yes, he managed.
Oh, that's good news. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, and have a great afternoon.